Welcome everyone back. I hope you guys enjoy your coffee break. Our next talk will be Andy Snowball from BAE Systems, and he's going to be talking to us about ransomware and a reflection about how 2020, what brought in terms of his experience for ransomware. Enjoy the talk, and remember that you can send your questions during the talk. Okay, and we will have a Q&A afterwards. Bye for now.
Hi everyone, and welcome to 2020, A Year of Ransomware. My name is Andy Snowball. I'm the Head of Incident Response at BAE Systems. And today we're going to be looking into what happened in the ransomware scene in 2020 and into this year as well. So we're going to start off by looking at sort of some trends that we've observed in terms of ransomware. Then we're going to look at some case studies from 2020, just looking to see sort of what the impact was on each organization, how the attackers got onto the network, what they did when they were on the network. And then finally, we're going to end with some recommendations to hopefully allow organizations to prevent this kind of thing from happening to them. So I'm sure you've all seen in the news, it's difficult to avoid really. It's literally on a sort of daily basis almost. Ransomware attacks are just happening everywhere. The indiscriminate targeting everyone. These attackers don't really care who they're going after as long as they're going to get some cash out of them. And you can see from some of the headlines that were pulled out here, just some of the impact that it's having. So some of the more recent ones on the top left of the slide. So we've seen the meat plants in the US being impacted and the Colonial Pipeline as well. These had huge impacts in the US in terms of supply of meat and in terms of oil supply and products. And then we've also seen sort of a bit closer to home in the UK, the Irish health system targeted as well. And it's taken these organizations a long time to recover, and it's quite a sort of damaging thing for an organization to have to suffer from. So this is just some of the headlines that were picked out. So how does a ransomware attack actually happen? So it starts off with the network intrusion. So somehow the attackers have to get onto the network. The types of ransomware that we're talking about here is human-operated ransomware. So this is malware that's being distributed across the network by a human operator. So they're doing sort of similar sort of steps to what would happen during a legitimate pen test. So the first step is network intrusion. So how do they get onto the network? The most common methods that we've seen attackers using are phishing emails. This is quite common for a lot of different attacks, and ransomware crews are going after people with phishing emails as well. It's typically an email that comes into the organization with either a malicious payload or some kind of link to an external website, which is under the control of an attacker. That allows the attacker to get an initial piece of malware, normally a remote access Trojan, onto someone's machine. And at that point, they've got access to that machine as if they were the user sitting in front of it. Second method is via a vulnerability of some sort. So vulnerabilities that we've seen exploited this year include vulnerabilities in Pulse Secure and in the Microsoft Exchange products that have both been patched. Any sort of external infrastructure that organizations have got, if there's a vulnerability in there that hasn't been patched, attackers are going to go after it. They're scanning the internet all the time to try and identify those vulnerable pieces of equipment or pieces of software. And if they're able to sort of get into an organization's network by exploiting one of these vulnerabilities, that is exactly what they'll do. Similar sort of story with RDP as well. You'd be surprised how many organizations still have RDP servers published to the internet. As soon as a new RDP box comes on the internet, it's like a big red flag for attackers, and they'll start spraying those boxes with credentials, doing credential spraying attacks, or even brute force type of attacks to attempt to get into those machines. And then the final methods that we've seen is via third parties or managed service providers. So this is an absolute goldmine for an attacker. If they're able to get into a managed service provider that has a lot of customers themselves, they're not only targeting the MSP, but they're also targeting that MSP's customers as well. So they can really have a very effective ransomware attack by targeting those MSPs. Once they're in the network, they're going to do a bit of sort of recon activity. So they're going to propagate around the network. They're going to try and elevate privileges. They may have come in as a normal user. So they want to try and get a high level of access on the network. Usually they want to try and get domain admin access on the network. That allows them to move around very easily. and they've got full admin access on all the machines on the domain. Once they've had a bit of a poke around and they've figured out sort of where things are, they're going to try and identify the organization's sensitive data. So this could be stored in a number of locations. It could be sort of file shares, it could be databases, it could be an internal SAP system. And they're going to really focus on that data. They're going to exfiltrate some of that data, and they're going to use that later on in the attack. The other thing that they're going to do during the recon phase is identify where the organization's backups are and how the backups are stored, because they want to go and try and destroy those backups as much as possible and make it difficult for the organization to recover. Once they've done all of this work, the destructive portion of the attack happens, and that's when they're going to start kind of destroying those backups and encrypting machines with the ransomware payload. Now, what do they do? So the final kind of step in the process is for them to demand a ransom payment. So you've probably seen all of these kind of locker screens that pop up when your machine's been ransomwared. That's one thing that they can do. Another option is just dropping text files onto people's machines. So when you go to open your documents folder up, you find that all the contents are encrypted, but there's a text file in there which has got the details of how to make the ransom payment. If after a few days there's no sort of payment from the organization, what the attackers will then do is they'll try and increase the stakes a bit. So some of that data that they've stolen, they'll start to publish some of that on their blog, and we'll look at some of the attacker blogs shortly. If that doesn't work, they might make some public threats. So they might contact sort of newspapers, the press, that kind of thing, and just inform them that this organization's had an incident. We've even dealt with incidents where the attackers have been phoning employees at the organization up to try and put additional pressure on them to pay up. If they've gone through all this process and there's still no payment, some of the groups have actually started to auction the data off. So whatever data they've stolen, they'll then try and auction off to the highest bidder, just trying to monetize that stolen data as much as possible. I mentioned about the blog sites. So these are examples of 3 attacker blogs. So Nephilim at the back, Revel in the middle, and then the Clop group. So these are all quite prolific attackers, and these are their blogs that they publish all of the victim data on. They're not particularly glamorous websites. They're not going to sort of win any awards or anything, but they are quite effective in terms of what they do. So you see the Clop one at the front there. They've just got a kind of list here of all of the victim organizations that they've targeted, and you can click on one of those victims and it shows you a page showing more details of the organization and links to sort of download their data as well. And you can see here as well towards the bottom of the page, they've got kind of an update stream, which is showing all of the data being published from each of these victim organizations. So they're really putting a lot of pressure on the organizations at this phase to kind of pay up and trying to get some cash out of them. So in terms of trends that we've seen, we've produced this chart. We've been tracking about 30 groups now, and we started the tracking sort of back in January last year. The purpose of this is just for us to sort of try and identify which industries are being targeted, and also sort of which groups are the most prolific as well, and see if we can sort of identify some trends here. So you'll see that there's quite a big sort of uptick in activity here towards sort of September-ish last year. Then it plateaus. So the peak here across all of the different groups, they're hitting about 8 victims per day. So that's quite a large number of organizations, and some of these are sort of big multinational companies that are being targeted. There's a big sort of downhill trend here. And this is probably because a lot of the groups announced that they were going to have a bit of a break over the Christmas and New Year period and have a bit of time off. So we do see a bit of a downward trend there. But overall, if you look from January to whereabouts we are now, it's still sort of trending upwards. So it's not a problem that's going away in any way at all. It's still kind of slowly increasing. In terms of areas targeted, we see about 55% of the victim organizations in North America. The likely reason for this is because those victim organizations in North America are more likely to pay. And that's what the ransomware groups are after, really. They want to target victims who are more likely to pay. And they've obviously determined that the North American group of organizations are more likely to pay than elsewhere. We have seen a number of groups who are targeting specifically organizations in Europe, so they don't target organizations in North America, that solely go after European organizations. And then we've also seen a bit of a rise in ransomware cases targeting Asia Pacific as well. So depending on what happens in North America, if they're going to introduce laws over there in the US around ransom payments, if that happens and it's more difficult for organizations to pay ransom fees, we're going to see these groups sort of targeting more towards Europe and Asia Pac as well. Right, so that's the kind of trends that we've seen over the last year and a half or so. So now we're going to look at some incident response cases that we worked on over the last year. Just sort of go through the details of what happened in each case, how the attackers got onto the network, what they did when they were on the network, and ultimately what the impact was to the business. So case number one, this was an organization with a large amount of on-premise infrastructure. So they had about knocking on for 2,000 servers. The attackers got onto the hypervisor infrastructure and ran the ransomware on the hypervisors. So they destroyed all of these servers. Basically, there was very little left when we arrived on site. They also targeted the backups. So this organization was using disk-based backup, and they wiped somewhere in the region of 190 terabytes of backup data. The organization had started to move some of their services into the cloud, but most of the business applications were still hosted on the on-premise infrastructure. So those business applications were all impacted and were all unavailable during the course of this incident. Cloud-based services, so the organization was using G Suite for email and collaboration and AWS for hosting. Those services were unaffected and remained up. And they were also using Chromebooks for end-user devices, which is quite an unusual thing to use. But those devices also weren't affected, which was really good news, actually. In terms of the sort of PR of this, the attack appeared in the national press on the BBC News website on a couple of occasions. So this was also putting a lot of pressure on the organization to kind of get services back up and running and recover. We were on site as an incident response team the day after the attack. So this piece of work came in as an emergency, and we didn't have an existing relationship with this particular customer. So we were on site sort of a day after the attack had happened. Second case we're going to look at, slightly different infrastructure here. So we've got a mix of on-prem and Azure hosted infrastructure, about 700 servers. The difference here was that the attacker was able to move into that Azure environment as well. And they were able to do that because there was VPN connectivity between the on-prem and Azure hosted infrastructure. And they destroyed somewhere in the region of 700 servers split between the two environments. Multiple business applications impacted again, this time including some safety critical systems, and it was specifically the monitoring around those safety critical systems that was impacted. The organization had moved some stuff into Office 365. So email was predominantly in Office 365, and they were also using SharePoint Online to some extent. Those services were unaffected and remained up. So that was good. And one of the challenges that we did have was this was quite a large organization, and this attack happened kind of in the middle of the whole COVID pandemic and lockdown. So we had about 10,500 employees working remotely. And we didn't, at the start of the incident, we didn't have any visibility on their end user machines, what was happening on them, if the attack had been on them. So that was a bit of a challenge to start off with. The press on this wasn't quite as high as the first case. In this instance, the details only appeared in security news and in some sector-specific news sites. And we were on site a couple of days after the attack. Again, this wasn't an existing customer. This was an emergency piece of work that came into us. Case number 3, this was a much smaller incident. It only impacted the organization's development network. It's quite a large development network that had about 120 machines on that network. There wasn't really any business impact other than the fact that the organization had quite a large team of developers who weren't able to do any work because their whole environment was down. There was considerable concern from the organization that the attacker might have been able to leverage the access that they had to move into the corporate network or their production environment. So we spent a lot of time sort of looking at the connectivity between these environments and sort of ruling that out as an option. There's no details of this attack in the press, likely because there was no real operational impact here. There wasn't any services down as a consequence. And this was an existing customer of ours, and we were on site the day of the attack. So how did the attackers get onto the network in each case? So in the first case, it was a vulnerable external service. So it was actually RDP in this case. So one of the network engineers at the organization had been working from home, and he wanted to make some changes that he couldn't do from home. So he decided that a good way to do this would be to open up RDP on the firewall to his desktop PC in the office. He did this, and it was about sort of 30 minutes after he did that we saw a larger volume of failed authentication attempts happening on his machine. It was somewhere in the region of 70,000 failed authentication attempts over a 2-hour window. And then we slowly started to see successful authentication attempts happening. And there was multiple groups on this machine at the same time. And one of those groups was the one that was able to sort of elevate access and move around the network a bit later on and ultimately deploy the ransomware. Case number 2, this was a phishing email that came into the organization. The interesting thing here was that the route that the phishing email came in via, so it didn't come into the user's corporate email, it came into his personal email, and he happened to be checking his personal Hotmail account on his corporate laptop. So you could see him sort of 12:30 lunchtime, opening his Hotmail up in his browser. He found this phishing email, clicked on the link in it. The link took him to a malicious Excel spreadsheet that was downloaded to his machine. He then opened the Excel spreadsheet up, enabled macros, and that enabled the SD-bot remote access Trojan to be dropped onto his machine. At that point, the attackers kind of got control of that machine as if they were sitting in front of it. And then the final case that we're going to go into a little bit more detail on, this was a drive-by download attack. So this was the smaller organization, the dev network. And the way that this attack happened was quite interesting. So I'm just going to sort of show you what happened there. So what happened was that one of the system administrators was looking for some drivers for a tape library. So he went onto Google, did a search on Google, and on around page 2 of the Google search results, you get an entry that looks like this. So it's taking you to a Google Docs page. And if you click on that link, you get taken to a document that looks like this. And it's got a link another link in here, which is to download the drivers, apparently. If you click on this link, you ultimately get some kind of malicious payload delivered to your machine. So what we saw happening on the machine in the browser, so we saw him doing the initial search up here for IBM Ultium drivers, didn't find what he wanted, so he refined the search a bit and added the model of the tape library in. Then he visited the legitimate IBM website. So we think, oh, that's okay. He's found what he's looking for. He didn't find what he's looking for on here. Then he goes to the legitimate Dell website. Didn't find what he wanted on there either. And then he finally hits the attacker created site here. The one that he actually hit was it was a sites.google.com address. And then shortly after he clicked on that link, you can see on the right hand side the time here. He's getting pinged between quite a few different URLs here. So you can see him hitting euclub.ru, and then there's this weird looking CF domain, then pserve.ru, and then he's been pinged between multiple URLs on this CF domain. What's happening here is his machine's being fingerprinted to determine what operating system it's running, if it's 32-bit or 64-bit. Possibly also looking at the IP address that the connection is coming from to see if it's an organization worth targeting. And then depending on what the results are of that, some kind of payload will be delivered to his machine. This is what we saw on disk when we're looking at sort of what was downloaded. So we saw this zip file being downloaded. So this is the malicious zip file from the attacker created website. And then he unzips that file onto disk. There's 3 executables within the file. Each of these are different types of remote access Trojan, and the attacker is likely bundling 3 in here in the event that one of them or 2 of them might get detected by AV. So they're sort of hedging the bets here. And then finally we see the execution of one of them happening, and we can see the Windows firewall being modified here to allow outbound connectivity from this VPN.exe to the internet. And at that point, the attacker has effectively got a reverse shell connection into this machine, and he's got the same level of access as what the system administrator has. Okay, so the attacker's on the network in each case now. So what did they do next? They want to elevate privileges and they want to move around the network a bit. So how did they do that? So in the first case, this was the machine with RDP exposed to the internet. We saw them exploiting a vulnerability in the Microsoft Background Intelligent Transfer Service. So this vulnerability was actually patched by Microsoft back in March 2020. And the attack happened in October 2020. So there's quite a considerable lag between the patch being released and the attack happening and the patch not being applied. So this is a good kind of reminder to make sure that you've got your patches deployed everywhere. The vulnerability in particular allows a normal user to elevate access to system on the machine, which is perfect for someone who wants to deploy ransomware everywhere, because then once they've got system level access, they can use tools like Mimikatz or Lasagna to then dump further credentials from the machine and use those on other machines on the network. Case number 2, this was a brute force attack. So this was the Excel spreadsheet that was downloaded with the SD-bot remote access Trojan. So the attacker would come in as a normal user, wanted to get domain admin access, and they managed to identify domain admin accounts that hadn't had its password reset since 2005. And they were able to brute force the password on that account. It took them about 30 minutes to do that from initially gaining access to the network. So it happened pretty quickly. And then in the third case, the attacker didn't really need to do anything because they'd come in actually on the backup server, and the system administrator was logged onto that backup server with the domain admin account. So the attacker immediately had domain admin access on that development network. Lateral movement. The tools that attackers tend to like to use for lateral movement are things that are already available for them to use. So they won't download additional tooling to the victim network unless they have to. So we see a lot of attackers using RDP internally. So once they're on to 1 or 2 machines on the network, they'll then use RDP internally to move on to server infrastructure. It's quite nice because RDP is still used a lot internally by system administrators. So any attacker activity using RDP is likely to blend into the background. Similarly with PSExec as well. A lot of organizations still use PSExec as well. If they're not using PSExec, then the attacker can download this quite easily because it's a signed Microsoft binary. It doesn't normally get detected by antivirus software unless you've got specific rules set up to stop it. These are the 2 kind of most common methods that we see for lateral movement. Other things that we've seen attackers using are using things like WMI as well. So most organizations have still got WMI open quite a lot. So if attackers can use that to execute commands remotely, they'll use that to kind of pivot around the network. So what was the post-incident impact in each case? So for the first case, so when we first arrived on site here, the organization didn't really have a huge amount of data left at all. Pretty much everything had gone. Fortunately for them, the attacker had deployed the Pisa ransomware. And this ransomware doesn't encrypt the entire file. It only encrypts a certain percentage up to a cap. And because the attacker had ran the ransomware on the hypervisors and had been encrypting these huge virtual disk files, the percentage of the file that was encrypted was very, very low. So we were able to sort of recover the rest of the file system from those VMDK files and recover quite a large volume of data for the customer. The customer accelerated the migration to cloud-based services. So they were already doing this. They had already started to move some stuff to AWS, but they made the decision that they didn't want to bring stuff back onto the on-premise infrastructure. They wanted to sort of make a fresh start, move into the cloud, and make sure that it was secured properly from the start. In terms of the recovery for some of the business applications is still ongoing now. Bear in mind that this attack happened in October 2020, and there's still some systems that are unavailable. And the attacker also stole quite a large volume of data and published that data on the dark web. So that was sort of quite embarrassing for the organization as well. In case number 2, the core infrastructure services, and this includes some of the sort of business critical applications, were recovered in about 2 months' time. Very little data was lost because the organization was using offline tape backups, so recovering from those was possible. We did have problems with the recovery initially because we had a large volume of tapes, and the backup catalogs for those tapes were stored locally on the backup servers that had been encrypted by the ransomware. So we had this big stack of tapes, somewhere in the region of 25,000 tapes, and it wasn't clear which tapes needed to be used to restore from, which ones had the latest backups on. So it's quite a bit of effort to sort of identify the latest tapes and get them restored. This case as well, we saw a huge volume of data leaving the network and going off to some attacker-controlled systems on the internet. We saw somewhere in the region of 1.5 terabytes of data going out, which is quite a large volume, and the majority of that data was published on the attacker's dark web site. Case number 3, the entire environment here, this is the dev environment, this was restored from tape backup in about 2 weeks. There was a few little challenges with restoring from tape, the problems reading from the tapes, but eventually it was possible to restore pretty much all the data. There's very little lost. They were able to restore from a backup that had occurred about 2 days before the attack. So there's no sort of significant data loss. And there was no data stolen or exposed by the attacker. So not really too sure why this is the case. This attack happened really, really quickly as well. So this is one of the quickest ransomware attacks we've responded to. So from the attacker gaining access to the network to the point where the entire network is encrypted was 7 hours. So it's really, really quick. So we don't know if, we didn't have any evidence of the attacker doing a huge amount of recon work. So they might have just not bothered to steal any data, or they might have looked at what data was there and just identified that there wasn't anything particularly sensitive and not bothered to steal any. Right, so finally, the most important thing is to learn from these incidents, I think. So what we've done is we've put together a list of recommendations that are based on all the ransomware attacks that we've responded to over the last year or so. And these recommendations are quite generic, but they help organizations to sort of bolster the defenses and also improve their ability to respond to this type of attack if they happen to be a victim of one. So recommendation number 1, ensure your backups are secure. So this is about keeping your backups offline or in some kind of manner that it's impossible for an attacker to tamper with the backups. So there's cloud-based backup services which will do this now. You don't have to use kind of legacy tape technology for this. The thing to avoid is having disk-based backups on-premise that an attacker can easily move on to. If you want to keep the backups on-prem, you could use network segmentation to segment those backup servers from the rest of the corporate network and make it impossible for an attacker to move onto that network segment. So there are things that can be done if you want to keep the backups on-prem and not use tape. Protect the perimeter of the network. So there's a few things here. So there's the first one is what services you're exposing to the internet. Have you got RDP sitting on the internet? Have you got a pulse secure VPN that hasn't been patched for 2 years? Making sure that you've got a good understanding of what you've got on the perimeter of the network and making sure that all that stuff has been patched and secured appropriately. So any services that you can log in remotely from and get some kind of interactive session. So if you've got Citrix NetScalers or some kind of terminal services access, making sure that all of those services have got multi-factor authentication enabled is pretty imperative. The other element to look at here is what traffic can traverse the perimeter as well. So in terms of email coming in, so have you got good filtering in place on your emails? Are you looking for malware or are you just looking for spam in the email? And also in terms of outbound web access as well, have you got web filtering in place there? Are you, what's the level that you're blocking sites? Patch IT infrastructure. So most organizations have got a pretty good handle on the Windows side of things and applying patches to Windows-based systems. Where we see deficiencies are in more infrastructure type components. So things like firewalls, VPNs, proxy servers, things that tend to sit closer to the perimeter of the network or on the perimeter. So making sure that infrastructure is patched effectively and you've got a patching policy and process in place for that is really important. Decommissioning end-of-life hardware and software. If you've got legacy stuff lurking around on the network, it's going to be there's not going to be any security patches being produced for that by the vendors. So if there's a vulnerability disclosed, you're unlikely to get a patch for it. It can also be more difficult to monitor this kind of stuff as well. So if you've got really old operating systems running and they don't support the latest EDR software or your antivirus solution, then it's really time to consider getting rid of that legacy stuff. Ensure common methods that ransomware use to spread are reduced. So this is human-operated ransomware. So it's a little bit more complicated than just looking at blocking SMB. We're looking at network segmentation here. So network segmentation can be done on a number of different levels. It can be done at the network itself, but it can also be done on the hosts using host-based firewalls. So what we see here is a lot of organizations have got the host-based firewalls configured incorrectly, and they're allowing inbound connections to end user machines effectively. So blocking inbound access to end user machines, so not allowing RDP to come in, not allowing SMB or RPC to come in, they're good methods to do to prevent lateral movement. Disabling SMB version 1 as well, to sort of minimize the impact to Eternal Blue type vulnerabilities is also a good recommendation. And just segmenting the network as much as possible, moving your crown jewels into more secure network segments with additional security controls in place will prevent attackers from being able to move onto those assets. Implement detections for pen testing tools such as Cobalt Strike. I think in pretty much every ransomware case that we responded to last year and into this year as well, we've seen attackers using Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike is a common pen testing framework, and it's good because it doesn't get detected very well by antivirus software. So having other methods of detecting Cobalt Strike beacons on your network or PowerShell Empire, that kind of stuff is really good. It needs to be more behavioral type stuff rather than looking for signatures. But being able to detect that stuff early on and alert on it is really important. If you see Cobalt Strike on your network, there's either a pen test happening or there's an attack on the network. That's kind of the two options. Implement application allow listing. Organizations do tend to struggle a bit with this. It's not particularly easy to implement, and it's also quite difficult to maintain as well. What we recommend here is sort of an interim method almost of blocking users from being able to run executables from their profile directories. That's one good recommendation. Making it hard for an attacker to run a payload on a machine unless they've got admin access on it, and then locking down the admin access as well. They're good recommendations. Enable credential guard in Windows 10 and stop users from having local admin access. So Credential Guard can help prevent attackers from gaining additional credentials by using tools like Mimikatz. Also, if you lock down the local admin access on machines and not allow end users to have admin access on their machines, which we still see quite a lot, that can really help in terms of the credential theft and limit the attacker's ability to elevate access on the network. Control highly privileged accounts. Again, this is a really common one that we see every single time. There's a domain admin account that no one knows what it's for. It's been sitting there since 2005 without its password set. Everyone's afraid to touch it in case they break something. Having good control over those highly privileged accounts like domain admin, enterprise admin is really important because that's what an attacker is wanting to get. You shouldn't be having users or system administrators logging onto end user machines using domain admin accounts. They should be using accounts with more restricted privileges than that. That can all help against credential theft as well. And then the final two recommendations. So making sure that you've got your playbooks and your incident response documentation up to date is really important, so that if something like this does happen to you, you're ready to go. You know what you're going to do. You know who you're going to engage, which parties, which parts of the business you need to speak to, and then conducting tabletop exercises to test that process out and make sure that everyone is familiar with it is super important. And that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much, Sandy, and welcome back, everyone. I hope you all found this talk as interesting as I did. We do have a few questions for Andy, and we will start with some of them. Remember that you can keep asking questions, and we will ask Andy. To start with, Andy, the attack that you described, how would it apply to cloud infrastructure, and how that would be impacted?
Yeah, so we have seen attacks against cloud infrastructure as well. It tends to be attacks against infrastructure hosted in the cloud, so things like EC2, AWS EC2, or Azure. And it's the same sort of techniques that the attackers are using to get into those environments. So they're using, an organization might have exposed an RDP server in Azure to the internet, for example, and they'll just be able to get into the Azure environment. The other method that we've seen them using is they'll get in on the on-prem infrastructure. And then if there's some kind of connectivity between the on-prem and the cloud environment that they can sort of traverse across into the environment quite easily, they'll do that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have a very related question, very similar, around whether actually moving to the cloud would be considered as a defense tactic, and what would be the key difference there. I think you covered a little bit, but is there anything else that you would like to cover on that?
Yeah, I think it does depend a lot on the organization and how they've got the cloud environment configured. So some of them have got these legacy networks that have been there for donkey's years, and they haven't really been very well secured from the start. Security's kind of been bolted on. If they're moving into the cloud and they've thought about security from the start, and they've put some really good security controls in place before they've started to move services across, then it can be quite a good opportunity for organizations to increase their security. But it does totally depend on how they've got things set up. It's still quite easy to mess up your configuration in the cloud and still allow these kinds of attacks to happen.
Mm-hmm. I guess the question is more in the way that traditional ransomware would be not particularly designed for cloud in general, but very good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, things like if you're using cloud-based services like Office 365, it's less likely to be attacked probably by a ransomware attack. Because the ransomware is typically designed to run on Windows-based systems. So if it can't move onto like a Windows-based system in the Office 365 environment, then it can't encrypt any data there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We have a question that I need to ask you. The question is, when to pay for the ransom?
So interestingly enough, none of our customers have paid the ransom fee. It's always come up in conversations, normally quite early on in the investigation.
Exactly.
And there's normally the conversation around backups. Do you have backups? Are you able to restore from the backups? But we've even seen organizations that don't have backups, and they still have refused to pay the ransom fee. Most of our customers are in Europe. I think the situation in North America is quite different. I think they're a lot more willing to pay over there. Most organizations have got cyber insurance. The cyber insurance market is a bit more developed in North America. So maybe they just pay up straight away and then worry about if they can restore from backup later. I think we saw that with the Colonial Pipeline, where they paid the ransom fee and then they got the decryptor, but they weren't able to use it to decrypt any of the data. So they ended up restoring from backup in any case. And then fortunately for them, the FBI kind of came along and helped them get some of that money back.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think, and this is not part of the question, but just a comment. I guess there is almost an ethical dilemma there as well, right? If you pay a ransomware, at the end of the day, you are promoting these type of attacks. I mean, these are conducted just because people pay for them. If absolutely no one paid, no one would conduct the attack. But yeah, it's
exactly,
an ethical matter as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and most of the organizations we've dealt with who've suffered these attacks have been speaking to sort of the National Crime Agency and the NCSC as well. And the advice they get from those organizations is don't pay. I mean, it's up to them ultimately if they do pay, but most of them have sort of taken that advice on and not made any payments. Yeah.
It's also difficult to explain to shareholders we are not going to pay for ethical reasons when a whole business may be on the line. I would imagine
yeah.
A difficult situation. Yeah. It's one of those situations where no matter what you do, things will not please everyone, right?
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation for organizations to be in for sure, yeah.
Exactly. We have two questions here, which are somehow related. The first one is whether any of the clients had security awareness training, and if so, whether that was useful or not. And the second question, somehow related, is whether some of these attacks could be prevented with some security standards, such as Cyber Essentials.
Yeah, so for the first question, most of the organizations that we worked with have had some kind of internal cybersecurity awareness training for their employees. So I think if you look at things like these phishing simulation attacks that most organizations do, if you send that out to every single employee and like 2 or 3 people click on the link, that's all it takes for an attacker to get into the network. So unless you can get that down to 0 people clicking on the link, there's still potential for an attack to happen there. So I think there is benefit in doing these phishing awareness training things, but it's not going to be sort of protecting you 100%. We really want organizations to focus on the technical controls that can put in place to like stop those phishing emails from coming in the first place. And if a user does make a mistake, then not allow the attacker then to move on from their machine onto other infrastructure within the organization. So have technical measures in place to slow the attacker down and make it more difficult for them. And then the second question around what sort of security controls can be put in place. So we are seeing still that a lot of organizations are sort of messing up the basic sort of stuff. So we're still talking about network segmentation, which has been around for a long time. It's a really good technique to stop attackers from moving around the network. But also we see organizations don't have controls in place around detection and monitoring. So if an attacker does get onto the network, they don't have any visibility. They're not able to detect that the attacker's on there until the ransomware has been deployed. That's kind of the point at which they detect. And it's really a bit too late by then.
Exactly. Very good. I think there's been a lot of talk and the relationship between ransomware and cybersecurity insurance, whether that is covered or not, or to a certain extent, to what point having one of those extremely expensive insurance would help in these situations. We have a question here. And they ask, did any of the affected organizations use their cybersecurity insurance to pay for your services? And whether when this happens, whether the actual ransom could be also paid by the insurance company?
Yeah, so in terms of paying for our services, most customers have had cyber insurance in place and they're able to leverage that insurance policy to pay for our services. In terms of the ransom payment itself, we haven't been in a situation where any of our customers have actually sort of gone down that route. But we have seen sort of in the news around AXA insurance in France. They were sort of stopping their insurance from being used to pay ransom payments. And then shortly after that, their business operations in Southeast Asia got hit by a ransomware attack. So that wasn't too good for them. But yeah, we are seeing sort of changes in the cyber insurance model. Because otherwise it's just going to be so expensive for the insurers to pay out. It's not good. But I don't know how they survive in the US. They must have, I mean, the charges for the cyber insurance must be so high. It might be sort of cheaper just not to pay the cyber insurance and just pay the ransom fee almost.
Exactly. Very good. We don't have any more questions coming in. I really hope everyone found this interesting. Andy, is there anything else that you would like to add after the presentation? Anything else?
No, I don't think so. No, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for joining in and for all the questions as well. Really good to see some questions there.
Brilliant. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. At 12:10, we will come back with David Gray. You can grab a quick water or coffee in the meantime. See you back in 5 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.